Hello there, students, and welcome to Mr. Liddle's History Bites. Today we'll be looking at Chapter 14, Medieval China, and we'll specifically be looking at dynasties and ideologies. So, by the end of this history bite, you should be able to answer two essential questions. How did the cultural forces such as Confucian values and Buddhism shape society in medieval China? And how did the Tang and the Sung dynasties use cultural forces to legitimize their states? In other words, how did they use these forces to secure their rule? With that said, let's go ahead and dive on in. So let's quick talk about what we mean by Confucian values. So Confucian values are a series of values based on the teachings of a man named Confucius in English, and in Chinese, Confuci, who lived very long time ago before this course had started. And his values are many and complex, but they fall under a few basic categories, one of which is the value of hierarchy. That is, to defer to people above you, right? The son will defer to the father will defer to the king, the student will defer to the teacher, right? The value of hierarchy keeps society stable and calm. This also includes something called filial piety, which is part of that hierarchy. That is the acknowledgement of those who have more expertise or are more moral than us deserve our respect, right? This also implies that you have an obligation to be moral if people look up to you, if you're an emperor, or if you are a leader or a teacher. Now, this feeds into something called the mandate of heaven, which is a concept of legitimacy. And it basically says that heaven, as in a broad term for the non-physical world, grants its will to an emperor to rule the earth. And as long as the emperors remain morally upright and have good behavior, they continue to have the mandate of heaven to rule. However, you have bad behavior, you lose the mandate of heaven. And throughout the Chinese dynastic history, many emperors have claimed that their predecessors lost the mandate of heaven because of their bad or immoral behavior. Now, this idea actually predates Confucius, but it fits very nicely into his ideology. And so the mandate of heaven and Confucian values go hand in hand with one another. Now, at this time in the course, we encounter something called Neo-Confucian values, which are the addition of a metaphysical element. In other words, the addition of a spiritual element, right? Now, Confucius himself was not very big on the afterlife or like spirits or life after death. He often said that if you can't even understand this world, why do you need to understand the next world? But at this time in Chinese history, a number of Confucian scholars, and including the poet Shuzi, discuss what they call a supreme life force. And they kind of incorporate this into Confucian values. And this Neo-Confucian value becomes the official ideology of the Sung Dynasty in China. And it also becomes very popular outside of China. And it's during this time that we begin to see the rise of a practice referred to as foot binding, which is when a young woman's feet are bound at a very young age that prevents them from growing correctly. And so if you think about your foot, you have a little bit of an arch, right? You have a little bit of an arch in your foot. In foot binding, the arch is extremely accentuated so that a person's foot is essentially a V shape. Now, this practice begins to appear around this time in Sung Dynasty China. It is believed to have some connection to Confucian values, right? The deference of women to men, the understanding, though, that men would take care of a woman, and therefore, because men would take care of a woman, she did not need to work. And so a lot of high-class women, and even some lower and middle-class women, had their feet bound as a status symbol, as well as a symbol of adhering to Confucian values. We also need to talk a little bit about Buddhism. Now, Buddhism actually begins in South Asia, outside of China, and is based on the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama, aka the Buddha, who rejects this world as an illusion and the belief that you can escape the endless torturous cycle of reincarnation via enlightenment. And we don't need to get into all the details, but this religion comes to China via merchants from South Asia. And in particular, a version of it comes to China called Mahayana Buddhism, which is referred to as the Great Vehicle. It's very open and flexible. This is in contrast to the other popular form of Buddhism called Theravada Buddhism, which is more narrow and strict in its practices. And Mahayana Buddhism becomes very popular because it offers a sense of salvation, right? It offers a way out of this torturous cycle of reincarnation, unlike Confucian values originally did, pre-Neo-Confucian values. Although, while it became popular at times, it was always perceived as slightly foreign up until the 1000s. And so there were several instances of persecution, probably the most notable being the great anti-Buddhist persecution of 840 under the Tang Dynasty. So the Tang Dynasty, despite its near the end of its dynasty's persecution of Buddhism, was very pro-Buddhist. And this is in part because they were part nomadic themselves. They were not an indigenous Chinese dynasty completely. So, for example, how did they demonstrate their approval of Buddhism? They permitted the monk Xuanzang to travel to India to gather Buddhist texts. It's during the Tang Dynasty that Mount Wutai in China becomes a Buddhist holy site. And we begin to see Buddhists from other parts of the world coming to China to visit this Mount Wutai. Buddhism also at this time brings the chair into China, which is sort of an interesting social development. Pre-chair, most Chinese had sat on mats. Pure Land Buddhism, which I don't want to get into the theology of it, but it's a uniquely Chinese version of Buddhism, develops during this time. It has some slight differences from Mahayana Buddhism, but it's a uniquely Chinese version of Buddhism. As well as the fact that Buddhists begin to use Taoist terms, which is another indigenous religion, around the same time as Confucian values. They begin to use these terms to appeal to Chinese people, right? To try to make their religion sound a little less foreign. So let's quick give an overview of these dynasties. Now, we've talked a little bit already about how the Tang was a pro-Buddhist dynasty, in part because they were semi-nomadic in their origins. But what also you should know about the Tang Dynasty is that it was a militarily expansionist dynasty. In other words, it expanded greatly outside of the initial borders of China, right, of what it began with. It connected parts of Central Asia and the Silk Road. It expanded into Vietnam. And this meant that they were concerned with trade because they expanded so much, right? They also constructed and improved upon existing internal improvements, aka features of society that would allow for greater production or greater economic development, such as the equal field system, which gave all peasants an equal piece of land, the introduction of a fast ripening rice strain that was able to harvest 2 times a year and to resist drought, which allowed for more food for more people. They promoted iron production, which China has a long history of producing iron, and the Tang Dynasty continued the tradition of promoting iron production. And while the Tang Dynasty did not begin the Grand Canal, that was begun by their predecessors under the Sui Dynasty, they did finish the Grand Canal, which linked to northern and southern China. And this is important because southern China is where most of the food was being grown at this time. And so that became really essential. Now, the Sung Dynasty is a strongly Neo-Confucian dynasty, right? We've talked a little bit about foot binding, but also there's something called the civil service exam, which had its beginnings under the Tang Dynasty as well, but really ramps up under the Sung Dynasty. And the civil service exam is how you get a job in the government. And it's based on Neo-Confucian texts. So you go and you take a test, sort of like the SATs, except they last a week. And you have to bring your own food, and you have to sit in a little cubby, and it's all free response. But basically, you have to demonstrate that you understand Neo-Confucian values via the reading of their texts. And this was the path to a position within the government. And so Neo-Confucian values literally formed the backbone of the Sung Dynasty's government. Some other notable developments in the Sung Dynasty would be the introduction of gunpowder weapons for the first time in history, as well as the development of paper money, the first paper money, and we'll talk more about that later, which promoted trade. Now, the Sung Dynasty was culturally vibrant and economically brilliant, but they were not militarily strong, unlike their predecessors in the Tang Dynasty. As proof of this, they lost the northern part of their country to nomads in 1000 CE, and would shortly thereafter be conquered by another nomadic group called the Mongols. I hope you can answer those essential questions, and I encourage you to do your own research if you continue to have questions. But thank you so much for joining me on this History Bite, and I'll see you next time.